All right. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our study hall. My name is Jeannie Clark, and I will be your host. Joining from our customer care team, we have Brittany Wood and AJ Ootman. They'll be helping address any questions you may have throughout today's presentation. All right, so today's topic is a review of advanced import files, and we're specifically focusing on the patrons, groups, sections, and members files. So just a reminder, import files are used to create or update records en masse. And as the upcoming November 2021 release will only support these advanced import files, today's session should give you working knowledge of advanced import files so you can be prepared to upgrade without interruption to your patron and groups data updates. So we'll start today's agenda with a high-level highlight of advanced imports. Then we'll move on to the import file requirements. So these are new. We'll review configuration settings and then the data requirements. Thankfully, not much has changed to the data requirements. And then we'll review optional file configuration settings. And then we'll wrap up with the review of the column name changes. And again, this is all with the focus on patron, group, section, and members files. Okay, so let's begin. Let's start with the advanced import highlights. So Advanced Imports features a dedicated import data app, and this was introduced, I believe, in version 10 of WebCheckout. And just recently in version 12, it's fully functioning, and there's a lot of great features of Advanced Imports and the data app. So let's take a moment and review just kind of the great new benefits of the import data app itself. So the dedicated import data app can be accessed by clicking the tiled menu on the top right of WebCheckout. So once you're logged in, you see the tiles on the top right, click on that, and then you'll select import data. You can also edit the URL and change the URL to end in /import instead of /WCO to directly get to the import data app that way as well. And operators must have the import files capability to access this app. So if the operator does not have import files capability, they actually will not even see the import data app option from the tiled menu. Okay, so with the dedicated import data app, and you see a screenshot here, this is what that screen looks like. All files can be imported in the same screen, and multiple files can be uploaded at once. So this might sound pretty trivial, but for those of you who are familiar with the import data screen now, what we call the deprecated import data screen, you have to select the tab of which file you're going to import, and then upload the files individually. Now you can go to the import data app, select add file, and just upload one file, or you can upload multiple files in one screen. And additionally, there's more features to the app itself. So this icon you see here, this lowercase I icon, you might be familiar with that already. It's in the tabs or the screens within the web checkout application. Similarly, this I icon will provide a documented list of all your importable fields, including required import fields and custom properties. So it's actually a live document. So as you add more properties to importable fields such as patrons or resources and types, we'll document those custom properties and what the importable field name is right through your import data app, right? There's also the log of your completed imports. So you've seen the integration logs from the web checkout admin application. We now have that same information directly in the data import app. And then finally, this fourth icon here, you can back up the database directly from the app itself. So we'll be going through actually importing a file through the data app, but now all the functions and information you need when importing, it's all in one screen. Okay, so continuing our highlights of the new advanced import, it really minimizes the chances of unintentionally overwriting data. So as the advanced import files now includes a configuration section where you specifically define which data fields are being updated, there's less chances of data or records being unintentionally overwritten or unintentionally inactivated. Right? And we'll go more into that later today. Moving on, there's more importable fields, including custom properties and signature on file date. I think one of our more requested features is the ability to import signature on file. So now you can do that. It's its own import file, and why stop there? Again, all custom properties are importable, and to find import property names, go back to your import data app and click on that information icon to see a list of all importable fields. Another new feature of imports, unique identifiers and origins can be updated via import. So again, if you're familiar with importing resources, and now you can finally clear out bad resource names and change them. And user IDs can be updated via import as well. This does require a secondary unique identifier, and if you are interested in that feature, Brittany did highlight how to change unique identifiers in our last webinar, which I will provide that information at the end of this presentation, so you can look back on that. Okay, moving along, the default behavior of patrons and section member imports is to add new records. So now there's this action configuration, which would be required to deactivate omitted patrons and section members from the import file. This is new behavior, as currently the patron and members sorry about that. We have had previous webinars where we demonstrate advanced import scenarios, and I highly suggest reviewing those because it's really informative, and there are some great new features you can do with these files. All right, so now let's get into the details of what's required in these advanced import files. Okay. So let's start with the new configuration settings. So this new configuration settings, they give us, the end users, more control over the import file. So with these configuration settings, we're able to define what the import file should do. So let's review. The first bullet point here, the file must begin with the configuration header, and it just copy it exactly as it is. It's _begin _config _. Not the developer, I'm just only the messenger. But we are adding to the database, so this is kind of computer sciencey things we're doing here, but begin config with the _ wrapped and then a single underscore in between. There are required configuration settings, and they are version, origin, type, lookup columns, and import columns. Some of the fields for these settings are predefined, while others you'll add in your own specific values. Right? So starting with version, this is a predefined setting. And for now, the value is always set to 2. Right? Origin is set to external in all caps, and it's the default value for imported records. Origin is case sensitive, but for the purpose of patron and group imports for today's call, origin should be set to external. Right? Type defines what it is that we are importing. Right? Type is a predefined value, and you see your list of types here. I just included the most frequently used. There are additional number, that's what we're focusing today, but then resources and resource type. Right? And then there's the lookup columns. Lookup column is the unique identifier. So WebCheckout knows what's being created or what's being updated. The advanced files now require you to say what the lookup column or what the unique value is. And so with this new requirement, it also allows you to set what the unique identifier field is. That's more advanced import scenarios. We're going to stick with the defaults for today's purpose, but that's a great new feature. Right? And then finally, the last required configuration field is the import columns. And these are the names of the data columns or the data fields that are to be updated. Similar to the lookup columns, with import columns, we have to explicitly state which fields are to be updated. And while up front, this may seem like this is more work, it actually, once you set it in the file, it's all said and done. And going back to highlights of the features of the new advanced import, by explicitly stating what fields are being imported or are being updated, you have more control over your data and what is actually being updated. Okay. All right. And then for the required data on the data side, of course, the file must include data, and the required data header, similar to the begin config, we have the _begin _data _, that's required. And then the data section requires the column headers, which are the lookup and import column values. Those are what's to be updated. And then the file should only include new records and fields and updated records, and just the fields to be updated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more a little later today. And then finally, this is just of the overall about the file. File must be a CSV that's comma separated with UTF-8 encoding. This requirement remains the same. This has not changed, but just want to highlight the file format, comma separated value with UTF-8 encoding only. So here's actually an example of what the new import file could look like. Many of you might be familiar with putting your data in a Excel file and then saving as CSV. That's all right, but a comma separated value file, just all of your values are separated by a comma. And so this is what I have an example here. So I've included the begin config header and the required configuration, version set to 2, type, this is what we're importing, set to person, origin is external. The lookup column, so what is the unique identifier? And the unique identifier is actually called user ID. This column label has changed, which we'll highlight today as well. And then import columns, what are the values that are required or that I want updated or to include? So with our patron records, first name and last name are required. That's listed here. We're going to include barcode, email, and status. So that's our required configuration data. And then we have our begin data header, followed by my lookup column, and then my import column, my header names, and then my data. So essentially, the new file requirements are the configuration section and the begin data header. And then there have been some changes to a few of the column names, which I will highlight. And comma separated value, that remains the same with UTF-8 encoding. And now for those of you who are on version 10 and more recent, you can download an importable file from the respective find screen in WebCheckout and use that file as your template. But I believe it isn't until version 12 that all of these configurations and all of these import features are fully available. So version 10, you can download a sample or a template file, and then starting in version 12, you can actually use these files and import to make changes in mass. right? So let's take a minute here and shift to Web Checkout and export an importable person file. Okay, so I am going to switch my screen here to Web Checkout. So please let me know if you cannot see it. All right, so I'm logged into Web Checkout, the July 2021 version. And let's say I want to add a few new patron records, and I want a template of the import file. So I'm going to go to the People menu, find People. Okay, and you do need at least one result, so one person. So I'll just enter in my name here. All right, and when you are creating a template file from Web Checkout's Find screen, the big takeaway here is that the result columns that you have listed here, what's included should be the fields that you want to update or add to via the import files. Okay, so person ID, that's required, it's already included. First name is required, included. Last name is required and included. I want to include barcode, email address, and let's say I want to add to this patron class and status. Status is actually a new requirement, which we'll review all the requirements for the data side, but these are the fields or the columns that I want included in my template. I'm going to click Find. I see my results, and now I will export as export importable. Okay, make sure your pop-up blocker is enabled, and you'll open the file. You'll download the file. I've actually downloaded the file already, and I'm going to open it in Google Sheets. And we do recommend using Google Sheets. Google Sheets uses UTF-8 encoding, and the file can simply be downloaded as a CSV file and imported into Web Checkout. Right? So this is the exact export out of Web Checkout. I just uploaded it into Google Sheets. You'll see all of the file requirements and some additional settings have been included in my export. So the begin config header is included, version with the predefined setting of 2 is included, type, person, origin is external, which is again the default for imports. The origin is set to default. Label, we'll come back to label. This is not a required field, so we'll come back to this. My lookup column, so what is my unique ID, unique identifier, and it is user ID. My import columns, last name, first name, barcode, email, patron class, and status, those were my result columns in my Find People report here, right? And then my non-import columns, this is similar to label, it is not required. So we'll come back to non-import columns. And then my begin data column header is there, or section header. Then I have my lookup column and then my import columns all listed here. Then finally, my sample data, which I used my account for. Okay. Now, as I'm adding patron records, I could very well keep my record in this file, but I'm going to add data over my own record. I don't want to accidentally make any changes to my record, and I just needed it as a template. So with the magic of preparation, I'm just going to copy and paste some users over here that I created, copy that, paste that over my data, right? And I'm going to download as a CSV file. Okay, and I'm going to go back to Web Checkout. Again, to access the Import Data app, you have the Apps menu and click Import Data. I already have the screen open here. I'm in my Import Data, click Add File. I'm going to select my person importable file, and I select it's been added. And you get this great feedback in the new data app. So it confirms the file that you've imported. The origin is external. The lookup column is the user ID. Here are the columns that you're looking to change or update, I should say. There are 8 new records and 0 records are being updated, right? My person file only includes these 8 new records. It's not going to update any other existing records in Web Checkout. right? I'm going to click validate. This would tell me if there were any errors. Validation, parse errors 0, validation errors 0. If I did have errors, I could click on this header and then it will list out my errors. And then finally, I click promote and my data has been imported. And I can verify that by going into WebCheckout, right? And look at my file here. Who did I just import? I imported a Nella. So just verify, and there is Nella. All of these patrons have a barcode ending in 2021. So I could even actually just include 221. And I need to make sure I have 9 records to create. It looks like this new person also had 2021 in their record. Right, and that's it. That's my patron import file, which I exported and a sample or a template from my Find People screen. I added my new data and the patron records were added to my patron database. Okay. Great. And I went off script for a moment there, and this is something I should have highlighted before you import. As a best practice, you always want to back up your database, and we made it as simple as possible as including that backup database feature right in the import data app. Are you sure you want to back up? Yes, and click continue, and you can back up straight within the application. Again, another great new feature. So whether you use the data integration module or you're manually importing the files, again, use the Find screen to create an import file template. This will be great for resources and resource types if you need a template to make changes. All right. And again, I do want to highlight this one more time. As you saw, my patron import file defaults to adding records and no longer deactivates omitted records. Right. So while I can confirm I added those 8 new records, I can still see I have 88 active records. Okay. So if your import file includes all active patrons and omitted records should be inactive, you have to explicitly include that action configuration into your file. Okay. And then this will actually bring us to our next advanced import feature, which is optional configuration fields. Okay. Optional configuration settings provide us additional information and import features, but they can be completely omitted from your file if they're not being used. Okay. The first optional setting is label. Okay. And it provides us information about the file. It's just a text field. Right? Then we have non-import columns. Non-import columns, you saw that in my exported file. They are fields or columns that are in your file, but you do not want those columns to be updated. You'd put that column header name in the non-import column field. Okay. As we're focusing today on updating your patron and groups file for the upcoming release, I recommend taking this time to clean up your patron and group files so that the file only includes the column headers or the fields that are being updated. We have so many importable fields that they don't all need to be included in the file, just the required columns which are being updated. And this way you don't need to include this non-import columns configuration setting in your file, since your file only includes import columns. Okay. Finally, we have an optional configuration setting, the action, which I just talked about in the previous slide. Action will allow the import file to inactivate records which are omitted from the file. Okay. So a deactivate action can be applied to patron, groups, sections, and members. My import did not have an action, which is why all active patron records remain active. And no action will update existing or add new records only and will not deactivate omitted records. Okay, so if you are not using these optional config settings, you can leave them off the file altogether. right? Or just leave the value blank. So let's spend some time reviewing these actions. Okay. So if you would like your import file to inactivate records which are omitted from the file, and most institutions will want this behavior to continue, especially if you're using the integration or doing a mass import, then you want to include the configuration setting action. With the advanced imports, there's no magic happening. So you have to explicitly tell WebCheckout what's being updated, including what records will become inactive. Okay. So for those of you who have not moved over to the advanced imports yet for integration or for importing patrons, the current files that you're using, what we call again the deprecated import files, they deactivate existing records in WebCheckout. Students or all active patrons. So to continue this behavior, you want to be sure that you want to include the action, right? Otherwise, if you don't include actions, patrons who are omitted from the file, they'll still remain active. Okay. So there are two deactivate action values. There's deactivate excluded and deactivate excluded members. The actions do the same thing. The only difference is what they apply to. So deactivate excluded, this applies to patron groups and sections, and it can be included in those said files. And with this, when the existing active records are omitted from said file, that record will become inactive in WebCheckout. Then we have deactivate excluded members. The action applies to existing active members records, and when they're omitted from the members file, that record will become inactive in WebCheckout. But the action itself, it must be included in the section file. Right? The members file is very pared down. There's very limited things, data points in the members file, including action. So while you want to deactivate excluded members, that action itself has to be in the section file. And when using that excluded members action, both the section and members files must be loaded together. So with these deactivate excluded actions, you can also include supplementary actions, verbose and unsafe. These provide additional information or even additional functions. I recommend verbose, which will list all records inactivated by the import file, so you get feedback. That information is actually included in the import data app, where you saw the feedback of my imports. You would actually see a feedback of all the inactivated records in that same import data screen. Okay. And then finally, we have a supplementary action, unsafe. When you include that action along with the deactivate excluded action, if you have an import file that has no data values, it will inactivate all records of that type and origin. So you might wonder, why would we want something like that? There are institutions who have wanted to deactivate all patrons, and it's actually, this might be something to consider if you're cleaning up your group's data. Until about 2 or 3 years ago, you could not inactivate groups, and now you can inactivate them by using this unsafe command or action in your file. And then, so all your old classes or old courses can become inactive, and then you would just import or wait till the next integration of your new class roster. And so only your active courses would be visible. That's an option there, and why you may want to use the unsafe once in a while, not something you would use more frequently. Right, so those are supplementary actions if you use a deactivate action. And verbose, I do recommend. All right. So for those with the daily patron file integration, or group integration, excuse me, or for those who import patron files with all active patrons, please be sure your files include the following configuration actions, right? So your patron file would include the configuration setting action, and the values would be deactivate, excluded, and I would include verbose, so you can see a list of all of the patrons who became inactive due to this import and action. Similarly, on your section file, you want the action configuration, deactivate excluded members, right? And then verbose. While this action is included in the section file, it pertains to the members file. So members who are omitted from that file will become inactive to that section. So here's another CSV file example or advanced import file with the optional values included. So I included a label person import file. Again, it's just a text field to provide more description. I did include a non-import column. Let's say I just wanted to see the department information, but I do not want this data changed or updated. So I included the department as a non-import column. This field will be skipped via import. And then I included my action, deactivate excluded. So any active records that are omitted from this file, when I import, they will become inactive. And then I included verbose, so I can see in WebCheckout which records actually became inactive, right? So let's just see what this optional value, this action setting does. And we'll go back into Google Sheets, and with the same import file that we did to add these 9 or 8 new records, let's go ahead and add the action deactivate excluded and verbose. So I'm not going to use this non-import column, so I'm just going to write over it and call it action. And we will type in deactivate excluded, and let's shift over to the next column here and verbose, add that supplementary action there. All right, so deactivate excluded, this will, if I promote and complete this import, it would deactivate all patrons of the external origin that have been omitted from this file. All right, so let's download comma separated value file. I'm going to go back into WebCheckout import. I'll click reset. I'm going to add my file. All right, and see here, there are total rows, updating 8, the ones that are listed in the file, deactivate excluded as included, and verbose is true. I can click validate here. It's validating. And then my import action message here, it will deactivate 74 records. And here are the people's records that would be deactivated. I'm getting this import message because I included verbose in my action, and this function of deactivating the excluded, again, that's being done because I've added this action deactivate excluded. I am not going to promote this because I do not want to inactivate all those 74 records. But this is a great way for you to get feedback and even test your files for any errors if you wanted to. So if you do have files and you want to see if they're compatible, you can, or if there's any errors, you can always test them in the import data app without completing the actual import, which I will not do there. All right. So we reviewed the new configuration sections and we touched upon the data, but let's get more into the details about the data changes, which is not much. Okay, so this is very trivial, but it is important. So again, the begin data header is required, and the required lookup columns and import columns must be the data headers, and all the and then the actual records and field values to be updated must be included in your data, right? So there's no changes to that requirement. But I do want to reiterate that the file should only include columns which are being updated and the records that are being updated. Again, this way, if you have, there are several implementations where you use patron note, for example. A lot of customers like using that patron note field when, so you can see additional information about the patron. That is an importable column. So if you include patron, if you exclude it from your file altogether, it essentially becomes a field that will not get overwritten by the import file, right? And that's new behavior. So again, only the fields that need to be updated should be included in your file. Okay, and just to note, while date is not a required field, the date file format requirement, for example, for start and end date, the requirement has changed, and it's based on your global locale setting. Okay, so if you would like the date format to be changed in your file, be sure that the global locale setting has been updated as well. Okay, so let's get into the specifics of the 5 files and the data requirement changes. Okay, so for the patron file, we'll start there. The following column headers have changed. So what we used to call person ID in the import file is now user ID. And if you are using department, department-name is now just department. Okay. Status is a required import column, and the value should be active. It should be active, but you do have the option to include inactive and inactive patrons as well. So I said this and I'll say it again, there's no magic with imports anymore. So things that you don't expect to happen shouldn't happen. And this also includes reactivating records. So if the patron is inactive in WebCheckout, they didn't enroll last semester, but now they are enrolled, their record should be in the file and the status set to active. If you do not include status to active, their account in WebCheckout will remain inactive. So status is required. Patron class, similarly to department, it's not a required import field, but the value must be in all caps. So all capitalization, undergraduate, senior, for example, employee. And these values are listed in the global settings screen within WebCheckout. So I've referenced global settings twice here, so I'll just take a pause. So under the WebCheckout admin menu, you'll go to global settings. Right? Here's a list of your patron classes, right? And what's in the parentheses shows you what the name of that patron class should be in your import file, the value, I should say. Right? So we have custom patron classes. Independent contractor must include this hyphen, and it must be in all caps. Right? And then I mentioned that the date format, you change the locale. So the global locale setting, this is what dictates the date format in your file. Right? Again, admin menu, global settings. Okay. All right. And then to summarize, the required columns for the patron file is user ID, first name, last name, and status. Right? And then, of course, if you have the email messaging module, you'll want to include email as well. So this is the data requirements, right? So here is an example of a patron file with all the required fields, including the configuration fields. Because I included the action, deactivate, excluded, you want to make sure your patron file includes all active records. Right. Now for the groups file, only the column header unique identifier has changed, and it's now group-identifier, and this is a required field. All other required columns are name and organization. So here is an example of a groups file with the required configuration and data fields. You can see here my type has changed to group. I have my lookups and import columns, also listed here in my data. For sections, the following column headers have changed. Unique identifier is now section-identifier, and group unique identifier is now just group. And this group refers to the group identifier, assigns the section to that group. And the required columns are section identifier, name, and group. Here's my section sample file. I have my type updated to section, my lookup columns, import columns, and I've included my action, deactivate excluded members, right, to continue the omission of members from the section. They become inactive, and verbose. I've also included in my import column start date and end date in my proper date format. And then finally, the requirements for members. Section unique identifier is now just section and references the section ID from the previous file or previous example. And then the member unique identifier is now just called member, and this is the user ID of that patron. There's only two required columns, section and members, and these are actually both lookup columns because they're both required, and import columns is optional. So here is my section, or excuse me, my member file. My type says section member, lookup columns, section and member, no import columns, and there's no action. The action is on the associated section file, which would be imported or uploaded together with this members file. Right. And then just to summarize this information in one slide, here are the affected columns with the name changes. And so person ID, user ID, department name is department, unique identifier is group identifier. For sections, it's now section identifier and group. Members file, section unique identifier is now just section, and member unique identifier is now just members. Okay. And with the import, I will show you here with groups, sections, and members, you can import multiple files at once. So I have my group file, I'll add that. I can add my members file, or excuse me, my section file. And I can add my members file. All three files in one screen. I get my feedback here, my group. Oh, I should back up the database first. I get my feedback here. I'm creating one new group. I'm creating one new section, and there's 8 new members added to this section. I can validate. With my sections, there's no section members will be deactivated since this is a new one. And no errors anywhere else. I can promote. And I created this new group here. Find groups. And it's the study hall group here I just created today. Here's my section with my start and end date. It's my creation time. So you can see that I just created this, this group with this section. Then I can click on the section to see all of the members who've been added. All right. Okay, so to summarize, for those with the, so to summarize, the files must include the begin config and the begin data headers. Right? It must include the required configuration settings and the setting values. So version, type, origin, lookup columns, and import columns, except for the members file, are required. And we recommend only including the lookup and import columns for your patron and group section and members files. Only the columns that are to be updated. Right? Those are your import columns. And then in order to deactivate excluded records, so if you want to continue the concurrent behavior of your patron and members file, you want to include an action. And the recommended action is for the patron file, include action deactivate excluded, and then include verbose so you can see who was inactivated by that file, by that import. And then on the section file, you want to include an action deactivate excluded members. Again, this applies to the members files, the members file, and also include verbose so you can see which members became inactive. And then for those who are on version 10 and newer, you can export an importable file from the respective find screens. But again, starting on version 12, that's when all the configuration features and all the importable features were made available. And if you are going to be exporting an import file from WebCheckout, be sure to include your result columns. Those will become your import columns, right? So you have an exact template of what is to be imported. And we also have templates of these files on our documentation site. So if you're on an older version, have no fear, we have templates available. Remember, the import data app also documents importable data properties, including custom properties specific to your instance. So the import data app should be really helpful for you. And if you can, always remember to take a backup before you import. Although since we have all these great new advanced import features, it is fairly trivial to make updates or fix what you've imported, but it's easier to roll back if possible if your import goes completely sideways, not what you expected. But the configuration options make it so that your import should be less prone to making unintentional changes. All right. So with that, we have time for questions. I see that there have been a lot of chats. So let me take a moment here. And I know our account managers have been really active answering your questions. Let me get to our list of questions here. And feel free, if you'd like, if you have questions you want to address and just speak to everyone, feel free to do that as well. Okay, and let me go back to some questions here. And Scott asked, is barcode mandatory? I don't use barcodes for patrons. And I see that Brittany answered this. Barcodes are definitely not required for patron data. Only, again, if I go back to my slide here, the required patron fields are for patron is user ID, first name, last name, and status. But if you use card readers, or if your patron's user ID changes, then you will want to include a barcode. But again, it's not required. Scott, did that answer your question? Great. All right. And then we had a question from Utai. He asked if the nightly integration script will not automatically inactive patrons. I see that AJ answered that question. Utai, did you have anything else to ask to that question about inactivating patrons and activating patrons? I hope that the action, me describing the action, helped clarify that question, and AJ as well. Just that. So yes, the integration or the import files, yep, can inactivate patrons automatically. All right. And Rob asked if status is a required field on the import file, and yes, it is a required field. And verbose, Utai also asked, is it only for the GUI imports, or does it work and show up somewhere if doing integration? Yep, it will only show up, verbose will show up using integration and the email report for automated integration. Okay, so I believe all the questions were answered. Were there any other questions I may have missed? Either the account managers, if there's anything you've tracked, or any of our customers, we can open this up for discussion. Here I am. And we can definitely wrap up early, but I reserved this additional time since, again, the upcoming release will require your files to be changed to this new format. We will still upgrade you. I believe we still will upgrade you if your files are not changed in these formats, but please be advised, if your files are not updated in the advanced format, your patron and group records will not be updated. So any questions before we move on? Okay, great. So I will wrap up with this. Keep an eye out for our release announcement. It's coming out around November 2020. It will come out this November. And for those who have on-premise servers, I'm going to give you the heads up now. The November 2021 release will require some third-party dependencies to be updated as a prerequisite to upgrade. So along with meeting all of our other requirements, which haven't changed, these two dependencies must be updated. So Postgres, both the server and client, must be updated to version 13, and the latest minor release is okay. And Node must be updated to version 14, and similarly, the latest minor release is okay as well. So just background, these updates improve application stability and security, and by removing dependencies on releases of these third-party services that are reaching end of life. And Yutai, I see you asked, can they be updated now in preparation? I know you're running a fairly recent version. I'll have to double check on that. Our support team did note that you will want to schedule updating these dependencies, coordinate that with the upgrade of your application. I know from some older versions, some functions like I believe email and printing are not compatible with these updated versions of these dependencies, but we'll definitely follow up to see if more recent versions, these can be updated prior to. All right, so if no further questions, thank you all for your time today. As always, please email support or your account manager with any questions. If you do have questions about or need more information about these files for integration or for import, your account manager, we're more than happy to walk you through these again or help you through these to make sure your files are ready. You can test these files on your own in the import data app, assuming you have a more recent version of the application. But again, contact us and we'll help you through that. And visit our website, docs.webcheckout.net, to view previous webinars. In March, we did a study hall where we did a full review of advanced imports, very similar to what we reviewed here today, but Brittany Wood hosted that, so a different voice and a different point of view. And then this past July, we went through more advanced import scenarios where, again, Brittany, our resident expert of advanced imports, she walked us through how to change user IDs, or excuse me, resource IDs, and really clean up your resource and resource type data using these advanced import files. So we'll wrap up here today. We will follow up with a recording and you can even share these slides. You can expect a follow-up by next Monday. But if no further questions, everyone have a wonderful day, have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll catch you all later. Thanks, everyone.